All right. So thank you for your patience. We've got everything set up, and I'm so glad to see everybody here this morning. I'm Clint Pumphrey. I'm the co-unit head and manuscript curator at Utah State University, and I'm also the SEMA president over the past year. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Conference of Intermountain Archivists here in Logan, Utah, nestled in the beautiful Cache Valley and home to USU. Go Aggies. It was 50 years ago in September 1973 when a group of archivists met in Salt Lake City to discuss guidelines for the bylaws and elect an interim slate of officers for an organization they named the Conference of Intermountain Archivists, which they at the time abbreviated CIA. It was agreed that the first meeting would be held at USU in Logan on May 3rd to 4th, 1974. Since then, the profession has progressed in ways that these founding members could never have imagined. Computers and the internet have led to the creation of new standards and platforms for sharing and promoting archival collections far beyond the reach of the printed finding aid. This same technology has also created one of the greatest modern challenges our profession faces: appraising, capturing, and preserving the mountain of digital records that are now produced. But as I learned recently, digging through SEMA's records held at the Utah State History Library, the Intermountain Archivists are an innovative bunch who have always shared a common purpose. We are all key holders in the world of learning, wrote Brigham Young University manuscripts librarian Dennis Rowley for his keynote address to CIA in 1974. We are trustees and disseminators of information. So while the tools we may use have changed, indeed, the central roles we fulfill have not. With that in mind, I'm excited to join together with all of you at this year's conference, remembering the past, embracing the future. 50 years after SEMA's founding, let's explore how we continue to serve those who entrust us with their records and the creative ways we disseminate information into that world of learning. Now, before I continue with some announcements, I just want to offer a land acknowledgement statement, which is based on USU's Logan campus acknowledgement statement. So we recognize that this year's Conference of Intermountain Archivists annual meeting takes place on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Sahivagoi, or Willow Valley of the northwestern band of the Shoshone Nation, on land ceded in the 1863 treaty at Fort Bridger. Today, we recognize Utah's 8 federally recognized Native nations, historic indigenous communities in Utah, indigenous individuals, and communities past and present. In offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm indigenous sovereignty, history, and experiences. Now, I firmly believe that these statements are more impactful if they're paired with action. And so one small thing that you all can do today, and I would encourage you to do, is to donate to the planned Boa Agoy Cultural Interpretive Center at the Bear River Massacre site, which is located just 30 miles north of here. A link and QR code where you can donate can be found on page 1 of the conference program. Okay, speaking of the program, this year's program is digital. There's a QR code here, which will take you directly to the PDF download for the conference program if you haven't done that already. And there's the link to the program. A lot of the information that I'll be talking about here is also in the program. So the Wi-Fi, here's the Wi-Fi information if you haven't gotten that yet. Conference Center with the Riverwood 615 password. And a new thing that we're doing this year, we had feedback about from last year, is people wanted a place to be able to communicate with the local arrangements committee if they had any questions. So you can text this number and someone from the local arrangements committee will get your message and they'll be able to help you with any problem you have. So that's something to check out. Okay. I also want to talk about something else we're doing new this year, which is a sponsor organization table drawing. So of course, we always encourage all attendees to visit our sponsor and organization tables, which are located out in the main lobby. As an added incentive this year, we're going to hold a drawing for 4 $50 bookshop.org gift cards. So to enter, take some time during a break today, and it's just going to be today that you'll need to do that. to visit one of the sponsor organization tables. At each table, you'll find a stack of business card size entry forms with the sponsor and organization name and a place to write your own name. So drop the completed entry forms in a box, which is an archives box, of course, and that's located at the registration table. One entry per table, you can increase your odds by visiting all of them. We're going to announce those winners at the reception tonight. So you'll need to be present to win those. So be sure to take a look at that. All right, I also want to acknowledge that we have a number of attendees that are online today. We actually have 32 attendees on Zoom. And each session will have a moderator. So each session that's on Zoom will have a moderator who will monitor the chat. So those of you who are online, please use the chat feature to let the moderator know about any tech issues that you're having and ask questions during the Q&A section at the end of each session. The moderator will read your question aloud, time permitting. In these sessions, it is also important that those of you who are speaking stay at the podium and speak into the microphone so that the people online can hear you as well. Not all the sessions are going to be streamed. You can look for the Zoom icon throughout the program to help you identify which sessions are going to be available on Zoom. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about the reception, and I am very excited about this. So those of you who have RSVP'd for the reception, I just want to kind of let you know that parking is a little limited. So we've arranged for 2 shuttles to run continuously between the Riverwoods and Logan Depot starting around 5:15. The shuttle pickup and drop off location is outside the main entrance to the Riverwoods. When returning to the Riverwoods, the shuttle can make a stop downtown. If you'd like to continue your evening there, you just want to let the driver know if you want to do that. The shuttle is going to stop running at about 8 o'clock. So just a little logistical thing. And then the last thing that I want to do before we get into our keynote speaker is just thank our sponsors. Obviously with everything is more expensive these days. And so we were thankfully able to limit the cost of this conference thanks to some generous support from our sponsors. And at the reception level, we have Utah State University Libraries, and special thanks to our Dean of Libraries for kicking in some money to help support the conference at that level. At the platinum level, we have the Brigham Young University Harold B. Lee Library and the San Jose State School of Information. Silver level, Hollinger Metal Edge, bronze, Lucidia, and advertiser level, we have Digital Bedrock. So if you could just please join me in thanking our sponsors. All right, now to the meat of the program here. Got through all those logistical things. So I want to introduce our keynote speaker this morning. Darren Perry is the former chairman of the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation. Darren serves on the Utah Humanities and the PBS Utah Board of Directors. He attended the University of Utah and Weber State University and received his bachelor's degree in secondary education. Darren is the author of The Bear River Massacre, A Shoshone History, and teaches Native American history at Utah State University. He lectures around the country on Native American issues surrounding history and indigenous views related to sustainability. He recently gave a lecture at the University of Copenhagen and spoke about indigenous views to climate and environment. His passions in life are his wife, Melody, 7 children, and 17 grandchildren. His other passion is his tribal family. He wants to make sure that those who have gone before him are not forgotten. Today, he will be giving a talk entitled History, Healing, and Restoration. So please join me in welcoming Darren Perry.
Good morning. I speak a lot. And what I love about this conference is I live close. I slept in my own bed last night. So with a 5-year-old granddaughter that didn't let me sleep very much. But I'm grateful to be here in this beautiful Cache Valley. It was late summer in 1926 when Moroni and Amy Timbimbu loaded their 3 girls in their car to make the drive to Riverside, California. Grace and Joanne, the older sisters, were about to attend the Sherman Institute, a boarding school for Native American children. Their motto was to kill the Indian to save the man. May, my grandmother, being the youngest of the 3 sisters, wanted to go along for the ride. She'd never been to California, let alone leave the Washakie Indian Reservation in northern Utah. When they arrived at the school the next day, May describes that she's never seen grass that was so green or trees that were so tall. And the flowers. Oh, the flowers. She loved flowers. After getting the older girls settled, they were ready to leave. May tugged on her dad's jacket and said, "Can I stay too?" This place looked magical. The smell of flowers was nothing like she'd ever experienced on her small little farm in the foothills of Washakie, where sagebrush and jackrabbits and rattlesnakes lived on the Utah-Idaho border. After walking back into the school and speaking with the administrator, it was decided that May could stay too. It didn't take long, however, for her to realize that the boarding school was going to be difficult. She was beaten and punished for speaking her language or mentioning her culture in any way. She attended the Sherman Institute for a couple of years and then returned home to continue her education at the Washakie Day School. But that educational process wasn't easy on a young Shoshone girl. One day while attending the Washakie Day School, the teacher singled her out and called her up in front of the class and made her stand on a chair and said, "May, you are going to turn out to be just like the rest of these children, sitting in the dirt and being useless for the rest of your life." I want to believe that it was right then and there that she decided that she was going to make a difference. She continued her education at Bear River High School. She went on to attend LDS Business College, where she received her degree in English. She then did something that literally changed the course of history for our people. She began writing down all of the stories that she had heard from the elders and her grandfather so that they could be preserved. She became an activist, a leader, a storyteller, and yes, an archivist. But more than that, she was my grandmother. When she died in 2007, a library burned. For a long time, American history was written and taught as a single story. It was a narrative of nation building and unending progress that united its participants into this single American experience. It was a national success story, celebrating the human triumphs made possible in a society based on principles of liberty and equality and justice for all, or so we thought. In years past, historians, archivists, and others sometimes ignored or dismissed peoples whose experiences didn't conform to that master narrative. Often dismissed were the experiences of the American Indian. After all, our story is one of decline and suffering rather than one of progress or happiness. And after all, their story is always remembered through an oral history lens. How do you preserve that? When the Indian story was told, It was usually portrayed as one futile resistance to the march of civilization. Just like in the movies, Indian history was little more than a chronicle of hostility towards settlers. The images of savage warriors attacking settlers became firmly fixed in popular concepts, well documented by Hollywood. But you know what? Times change. And the history and the stories that we tell about the past changes too. Understanding the past involves looking at history from the viewpoints of many people who have made it over the centuries. I believe American Indians must be included as a central strand in the history of this country. Our historical experiences require us to look beyond the stereotypes and maybe rethink some basic assumptions that we've had about history and how we remember it. I've come to realize over a lifetime that when we reduce history to just data collection, when we remove the emotional or the storytelling side, we lose some of the humanity that makes history so important. And I believe that's why the Shoshone story is so important, and many other stories of marginalized groups in our world today. Long ago, the vastness of the Great Basin, there lived a Shoshone man who was known as the keeper of the records. He was responsible for tracking down all of the important events in the tribe's history, including births, deaths, marriages, battles, and other significant events. He recorded all of these on animal hides, using symbols and pictures to tell the story. The keeper of the records, they called him. He took his job very seriously because he knew that the stories that he recorded would be important for the future generations of the tribe. He believed that the stories were like seeds that needed to be planted and nourished so that they could grow and flourish. Well, one day a fire broke out, and many of the animal hides that contained the tribe's history were destroyed. The keeper of the records was heartbroken, but he did not give up. He knew he had to start again to rebuild the tribe's history. He traveled far and wide, seeking out the elders of the tribe, and he began listening to stories. He wrote down their memories. He incorporated them into the tribe's history. He also taught the young people of the tribe the importance of recording their own stories so that one day they could be passed down to the future. In time, the keeper of the records became known as a great storyteller and historian. His work helped to preserve the tribe's history and the culture for future generations to come. And although the animal hides which he had originally recorded on were lost, his legacy lived on in the hearts and minds of the people. You see, for thousands of years, tribal elders would sit down with the children and tell them stories. The stories were always the same. There was never a word out of place. It had to be that way. It had to be accurate. Our children needed to hear the stories as the elders had heard the stories, because in our culture, nothing was ever written down. I went through this process with my grandmother, May Timbimbu Perry. She'd sit for hours. She'd tell me stories about how the coyote stole fire, or how the bald eagle became bald, or our creation story that starts at Antelope Island. And then sometimes with a tear in her eye, she would tell me the story of the massacre at Bo'ogai. There's an old Indian saying that I love that says, when an old Indian dies, a library burns. And that was never as true as it was about my grandmother. You see, to Native American peoples, storytelling is an integral part of our culture and tradition. Storytelling is a way of preserving and passing down traditional knowledge and values and beliefs from one generation to the next. The stories are always often told in the form of myths and legends and fables, and they are often used to explain the origins of the world. These stories also convey important moral and ethical reasons and lessons, and offer guidance on how to live in harmony with nature and with one another. Storytelling is a way of connecting with the past and honoring one's ancestors. Many Native American stories are based on the experiences and the wisdom of the tribe's elders and their ancestors. By retelling these stories, Native Americans keep their cultural heritage alive, and they honor the wisdom and the knowledge of those who came before. Storytelling is a way of building community and strengthening social bonds. Traditional storytelling often takes place in communal settings where people gather around the fire in a circle to listen to the storyteller. This shared experience creates a sense of unity and belonging, and it reinforces the tribe's cultural identity. And storytelling takes on a form of artistic expression that celebrates the creativity and imagination of Native American peoples. Native American stories are often rich and vivid with imagery, symbolism, metaphors, and they are often told in a lyrical and poetic style that reflects the beauty and the complexity of the natural world. Land was always used as pedagogy. As I grew older and I attended school, I developed this great love for history because of my grandmother. Sitting in class one day, I suddenly realized that none of the stories that my grandmother told me were in our history books. How could that be? I'd always believed that historical events were an absolute. I believed that events that transpired over time had one conclusion. But as I've gotten older, I've come to realize that history is about perspective. Whose perspective? And then one day I read a quote attributed to the great English leader, Winston Churchill. And he said that history is only written by the victors. And may I add, memorialized as well. I guess that explains why Native American histories were never written. But they need to be. My Shoshone people were indigenous to this valley where we're at today. We were hunters and gatherers. We traveled with the changing seasons. We looked upon the earth as not just a place to live, but something so sacred and special that we called her mother. She was always the provider of our livelihoods. We believe that the mountains and plains and streams stand forever, and seasons walk around annually. We traveled to different areas when the game was plentiful and the seeds and berries were abundant. We were here when Brigham Young and the first group of pioneers arrived at the Salt Lake Valley. We were friendly. We tried to get along. We even showed the pioneers what plants they could forage in those early days before their crops had a chance to grow. We helped them survive. But in the end, it was two different groups of people living two different lifestyles, and something was about to give. As one contemporary Shoshone man said, we tried to be hospitable. We tried to get along. But in the end, it wasn't enough. They wanted everything. They wanted our Creator's land. what happened next should never be forgotten. On January 29th in 1863, the largest massacre of Native Americans in the history of this country happened just 2 miles north of Preston, Idaho, just not very far from our location today. It was a massacre of my Shoshone people perpetrated by the U.S. Army stationed at Camp Douglas, Utah. While Brigham Young and the Mormon pioneers didn't fire a bullet that day, their presence, their depletion of the resources was absolutely the cause. There are many reasons that this event has been largely forgotten, but I am working hard every day to change that. How did people from Cache Valley come to terms with this tragic event, and how did they want it to be remembered and memorialized? Just north of Preston, Idaho today, there's an old monument, and I guess some of us get to go see it Saturday. It's just off of Highway 91. This old monument was erected in 1932 by the people of Franklin County. The construction of this Battle Creek marker took place during the rise of heritage groups and developing nostalgia for pioneer ancestry as a way of cultural expression. These heritage groups collected and tended the stories of the community, which formed the core of public memory. These stories became the means by which stories could shape, be told, and analyzed. As generations of people and historians and archivists and the general public discovered their fascination with the past, the pioneers and the monument allowed ordinary people to celebrate local ancestors and to seek inspiration in the present by making their relatives from the past seem almost heroic. The story of the Mormon pioneer would become an authentic American image that was dependable and resilient for years to come, eventually culminating in a state holiday. But the monument and those who planned it took it one step further. It was decided that the descendants of Chief Sagwitch, my third great-grandfather, his son Yeager, who also survived the massacre, and his grandson Moroni Timbimbu, my great-grandfather, should be the ones to unveil this new monument. I have a black and white photo which captures many of our tribe invited to that event in full regalia to the dedication ceremony. But it also captures Yeager dressed in typical Mormon fashion, a white shirt and a black tie. So, just like the pioneers, the Indians were now an authentic symbol of pioneer life, which supported the motivation of these heritage groups to celebrate pioneers as the founders of these new Indian civilizations. The Indians that were invited to the dedication were now culturally and religiously assimilated into the Mormon Church. The wayward and savage Indians of 1863 had now been culturally transformed, much like the landscape that the pioneers set out to conquer. After their invitation to the ceremony, it celebrated the triumph of pioneers over the Indians who had originally threatened the pioneers in their very existence. But the monument was never really meant to tell the story of that day. It was meant to tell us how it wants the past to be remembered. What the monument really accomplished for me is that it gives people a reason to forget. That monument strips us of our obligation to find out for ourselves what took place. That monument tells us how it wants the past to be remembered. You see, humans have great memories for what we want to remember. In commemorating the battle, you tend to forget the uglier parts of history, and you only focus on the heroism of the soldier and the saint. And that's the kind of Daughters of Utah Pioneers monument that exists there today. And that narrative now becomes the story. It's not a story about my people that died. It becomes a story about the brave soldiers and the pioneer women who took care of them. In constructing this monument, you firm up memory and you create what I say is false history. You decide. The plaque on the monument reads, "Attacks by the Indians on the peaceful inhabitants in this vicinity led to the final battle here on January 29th in 1863. The conflict occurred in deep snow and bitter cold. Scores of wounded soldiers were taken from the battlefield to the Latter-day Saint community of Franklin, Idaho. Here, pioneer women, trained through trials and necessities of frontier living, took care of the wounded until they could be removed to Camp Douglas, Utah. 2 Indian women found alive after the encounter were given homes in Franklin." So I suppose my question for you is that really what happened? The problem with that narrative and how we remember is that it really gives us one point of view from one generation's perspective, 69 years after the actual event. It's like a view from a small window that has been carefully placed to exclude a whole quadrant of a beautiful landscape. You only get to see what they want you to see. It reinforces the view that Indians were savages and went so far on one of the plaques as to label our women and children as enemy combatants. It reinforces the view that violence on the frontier was necessary for the survival of Mormon communities. And it showed what the consequences would be if both groups tried to share the same space. What if the plaque had been written from the perspective of the Shoshones? What do you think it would have said? Maybe it would have said this: "The massacre of the Northwestern Band occurred on this vicinity on January 29th in 1863. Colonel Patrick Edward Connor and his California volunteers from Camp Douglas, Utah, attacked a sleeping Indian village in the early morning hours of the day. The soldiers shot, raped, bludgeoned, and bayoneted several hundred men, women, and children to their death. The Indians fought back with the limited weapons available to them, but the band was all but annihilated. So which version do we write down? Which version do we remember? Which version is correct? The answer will always lie in your perspective. How do we reconcile the past? We can't transport ourselves back in time. So it may be difficult to understand the past and what it meant to people who lived in it. Our goal, I think, as archivists in history, should be to work hard to preserve it, to preserve all of the stories, both written and oral. But sometimes our attempts are sometimes clouded by our own current concerns, beliefs, value systems we grew up with. How then do we understand the past that may look different than our own views and beliefs? And by the way, I'm a 6th generation Shoshone Latter-day Saint, in case you think I'm bagging on the church. I'm not. Historical perspective involves viewing the past through the social and intellectual and emotional lenses of the times in order to understand what life was like or those who actually lived in it. When I was growing up, I remember my grandmother telling me stories about our people's history and culture. One story that also always stuck out to me was about the importance of preserving our traditions for future generations. She told me about a time when our ancestors were forced to leave their land and give up their way of life. They were told they needed to assimilate into this American society and abandon their traditional practices. But despite the incredible pressures they faced, our ancestors refused to give up this culture. They held on to their languages and songs, their dances, their stories, and they began passing them down from generation to the next. They knew that if they did not do that, they didn't preserve their own traditions, they would be lost forever. I am grateful for the role that Native American storytelling and oral history has played in the lives of my Native American brothers and sisters. We have always placed a high value on oral traditions as a means of passing down knowledge, history, and our culture from one generation to the next. Oral history helps us to preserve cultural continuity and reinforces a sense of community identity and belonging. It provides us with a connection to the past that is often lost in written history. By hearing stories and passing down songs through generations, Native Americans can maintain a connection to their ancestors and cultural heritage. When I hear this song, hey, hey, ya, ya, hey, ya, hey, ya, hey, ya, ya, hey, ya, it is a reminder of the teachings of my people, and my grandmother would sing it to me all the time. Oral history has a significance in the spiritual world as well. For many Native Americans, oral history is not just a collection of stories, but it is a deep spiritual practice. Oral histories are often shared in the context of sacred ceremonies and rituals, and they become the stories themselves. They have a spiritual significance. My grandmother always spoke of our land and air and water and plants as our non-human kinfolk. Think about that. What's our relationship to kin? It should be the same with those things that we don't normally think is kin, because they all have a spirit. Today, many Native American languages are endangered, and the preservation of oral history is an important means of keeping these languages alive. By learning and sharing traditional songs and stories, younger generations can be more fluent in their ancestral languages. And oral history plays a significant role in many Native Americans to continue their sovereignty. Native Americans' stories of resistance and resiliency and preservation in the face of colonization and oppression. These stories emphasize the importance of maintaining cultural traditions, to fight to protect the land and its resources for all Native American communities. By preserving and passing down their oral traditions, Native Americans are better able to assert their sovereignty and assert their right for self-determination. Long ago, the Shoshone people lived in harmony with the land and the animals around them. They had a deep respect for tradition and culture, which were passed down from generation to generation through stories and ceremonies. But as times passed, Shoshone began to face many challenges. White settlers began to move into the territory, bringing with them new ideas and ways of life. The Shoshone people were forced to adapt and change in order to survive. As years went by, many of the old ways have been forgotten, much like they are today. Younger generations began to lose touch with their traditions and cultures. The elders of the tribe saw this and knew that something had to be done to preserve their way of life. One day, a group of elders gathered together to discuss how they could preserve their culture for future generations. They knew they needed to pass on their teachings in a way that would be meaningful and relevant to the younger generations of the tribe. One elder spoke up and said that we need to create a new ceremony, one that would incorporate the old ways and the new. He suggested that they bring together the drumming and singing with their traditional ceremonies with dance and music of the new world. The other elders agreed, and they created a new ceremony that combined the old and the new. They called it the powwow. And it became a new way for many Native American people to pass on their culture and traditions to the younger generations. Today, powwows are held all across North America, and they continue to be an important way for tribes to celebrate their culture and connection with their traditions. The Shoshone people remember the story of the elders and the creation of the powwows as a reminder of the importance of preserving their culture for future generations. Another way of preserving and recording our culture was through petroglyphs. Less than 50 miles from our location today, there's a vast majority of petroglyphs on your way out to Corinne. You can find a significant number there from three periods: the Archaic, the Fremont, and the Shoshone. Petroglyphs serve as a means of communication and storytelling. They were always used to record important events and stories such as battles, hunting expeditions, and religious ceremonies. Petroglyphs often depict imageries of animals and people and symbols that convey specific meanings and messages for those who could interpret them. By creating these images, Native Americans were able to pass down their cultural heritage and history from one generation to the next. Petroglyphs serve as a means of spiritual expression. Many lives were created as part of a religious and ceremonial practices, and they often depict images of deities, spirits, and other supernatural beings. These images were believed to have power and significance, and they were used in spiritual practices to communicate with the spirit world and to seek guidance and protection. Petroglyphs also serve as a means of marking territory and establishing cultural identity. Many petroglyphs were created in places that were considered sacred or significant to one particular tribe or another. By creating these images, Native Americans were able to assert their presence in a particular area and to establish cultural identity. And finally, petroglyphs serve as a means of artistic expression. Many of those petroglyphs are highly intricate and detailed, and they demonstrate the artistic skill and creativity of the people who created them. These images are often rich in symbolism and meaning, and they offer insight into the aesthetic and cultural values of many Native American peoples. Today, as archivists, you play an important role in continuing that tradition of preservation. By archiving our people's stories, you are ensuring that our culture will be passed down for future generations. You are helping to keep our traditions alive, just as our ancestors did many years ago. Why is archiving so important? It's important because archiving people's stories helps preserve history by documenting events, experiences, and perspectives that might otherwise be lost. These stories provide insights into the past, and they help us better understand how we got there. Archiving helps people's stories and shows how important they are to cultural heritage. By archiving these stories, we can ensure that future generations have access to rich cultural traditions and practices that make up our identity. Archiving people's stories help to establish personal connection between individuals and communities. When we hear people's stories, we are better able to empathize with them and understand their struggles and triumphs. This can lead to greater compassion and a sense of shared humanity. Does our world need that today? Archiving helps people provide a valuable way to learn. By studying the experience of others, we gain insight into different perspectives. We learn from the mistakes of the past, and we develop a greater understanding of the world around us. I was taught the other day, and I learned a lot. I met a group of fourth graders at the Bear River Massacre site at the DUP monument. I like to start there. As we looked at the monument and talked about the meaning, there's an old tree next to the monument. I call it the honor tree. People hang things in the honor tree for those people who passed that day. As me and 70 fourth graders were staring at this tree, one of the boys noticed a mirror hanging in the tree. He said, "Hey, I see a mirror hanging in the tree. What do you think it means?" I had no idea. I was stumped. I was frantically trying to come up with a clever answer, and they all looked at me like I knew. And then a little smallest girl in the class spoke up. And she said, "I know why that mirror is hanging in the tree." I said, "What do you think?" And she said, "It's here to remind us that we did this. And if we don't learn from history, we can do it again." Oh my gosh. The hair on my head stood up. I looked over at the teacher, and I was taught that day by a fourth grader. Archiving people's stories can be a source of inspiration. Hearing about the challenges of others and what they have overcome and the achievements they've made can motivate us to strive for our own goals and aspirations. I'll bet every one of you has a pioneering story of an ancestor who made their way across the plains, uphill all the time in the winter, no shoes. And they use it, and we use it as a source of strength and encouragement, especially in troubled times. Well, everyone but me, of course. I don't have an ancestor that came across the plains. Amidst the dusty shelves and files where time and history reconcile, the archivist doth toll each day to preserve the past in every way. From letters yellowed with age to photographs and books on the page, the archivist gathers all in her care with meticulous attention rare. For in these records lie the story of human life and all its glory, of triumphs great and sorrows deep, of secrets kept and dreams we keep. And so the archivist's work is vital to ensure our history is not idle, but lives on for generations yet to come, to inspire and inform and help us become. So let us honor the archivist's tasks and all of the knowledge that she unmasks. For through her tireless and careful labor, we can all learn and grow and savor. Archiving is about life and living. It's so much more about than getting lost in the past. But you are much more about understanding the present. You guys have one of the best jobs in the world. There are not that many jobs where it can be said that what you do today will still matter in 100 years. Think about that. That's pretty dang cool. I hope you have a passion for what you do for history. I hope you have an eye for detail and a strong commitment to service. You are the custodians of society's memory. Let me leave you with one more story. It's a story from my youth, and I promise it's true. I used to love a certain time in the late summer. I'd get in my grandmother's Oldsmobile, and I would take what I thought was the longest ride in the world to the Cache Valley. She lived in Clearfield. I think it took like 1 hour to get there. And it's actually where I live today in Avon, south end of Cache Valley. The car would come to a stop. We'd get out and we'd go to the trunk, and she would pull out this woven willow basket that was stained purple through years of use. I knew then that it was time to harvest choke cherries, something that her people had done for centuries, always in the same place at the same time. After offering a prayer to the Creator, and then to Mother Earth, and then another prayer to the berries themselves, we would begin picking those berries with such care that we wouldn't even harm a leaf on a tree. She taught me the importance of knowing when the berries were ripe. She taught me the importance of saving those berries for future use. And she taught me the importance of leaving some of the berries on the branch for those yet to come. As I think about life today, I refer back to those berries, and I think about what you do and how we can relate this story to that. As you as archivists with your baskets firmly at your side, as you gather knowledge, gather things to preserve, I hope you're learning everything you can about what you're putting in your basket. And I hope you're putting everything in your basket to be preserved for another day. And then one day, when someone in your circle is in need, needs a friend, needs a little encouragement, what are you going to do? How can you use the berries of knowledge and facts and digital recordings and everything? How can you use what you have gathered to help somebody in need? You can always help somebody in need, and people come to you for those things all the time. I hope you will take the time to cherish what you do, cherish the information you're saving, And then one day when somebody is in need, you can pull out those berries of knowledge and use them for somebody in need. Cherish those berries, cherish your jobs, and use it in a way that you can help others. I'm grateful for Utah State University. We digitized all of our records within the tribe, and Utah State has generously taken them and will archive them at the school. And so that digital footprint of the Northwestern Band of Shoshone Nation, as we started gathering and preserving this knowledge, will be there forever. I'm grateful for the opportunity you've given me to come and speak today. So thank you very much. I guess I've got to take questions, if not that I have an answer, but I'll try.
Thank you so much. I wonder, it seems like the raising generation is very distracted, whether it's regardless of their ethnic background. And I was just wondering what you perceive is the success of powwows or other means for the younger generation to soak up those stories and to be able to transmit them.
Great question. And I'm glad you asked that, because I spoke at a diversity, equity, and inclusion conference at Utah State a couple of years ago. I was a keynote speaker. And after, there was a luncheon, and I sat next to a young girl. And she said, "What is your biggest problem within your tribe?" And I said, "Getting our kids to want to learn the culture and the language." And I said, "They're like your kids. They want their cell phone and they YouTube and everything else, anything but culture." And she says, "Well, we need to do something about that." And so she looked like she was 12 years old, but actually she's a professor in technology at USU. And she introduced herself, and over time we met and we wrote a grant. And we talked about ways to engage our kids. What we figured out was our kids are into technology. They want that experience. And so we thought, how can we combine technology with storytelling and learning the culture? And so our grant was funded well by the National Science Foundation. And so over the last few years, we've been incorporating technology into the system. And what we did, we sent out a flyer saying, all those youth that want to participate, we'll give you a video recording camera. You'll get a free laptop. I mean, with the amount of money we received, we were able to really sweeten the pot with gadgets. And so we did. The first week we had 7 kids show up, I mean, to collect the stuff. And through that, we started teaching them to do interviews and use the technology that we were giving them. And we'd say, well, go interview a tribal elder. And so they're starting to interview tribal elders. And they're starting to hear the culture. But what was really cool was the tribal elders, who had always been relied on to tell the stories and pass down information. That generation of elders, the kids didn't want to learn that way. And so they had no platform to really be who they were. And so it helped. That was a casualty in a good way for the elders too. The next week we had 15 people. And by the end, we had 70 of our kids signed up using technology. And we had a plant walk up Blacksmith Fork Canyon last summer. And we had 55 families and all of their children show up. And we videoed the plants that were used as food and medicine. We took this journey into culture. And now these kids are they're filmmakers. We've created 70 filmmakers, but they're filming cultural things that we are going to show some of these films at the Interpretive Center when we get it built, and use that in a way, but it's reintroduce the kids back into the culture. through technology. Look, I can barely send a text message and email on my phone, but and we laugh about that. Me and this professor still laugh about that because they got a lot better with it since then. But we've incorporated technology into the system, and it seems to be working. The Eastern Shoshones developed an app, a language app for the phone. So you can, it's a free download. You can, with Montana State, they developed this app for the phone that you can learn the Shoshone language from. And it's actually pretty cool because you hear the Shoshone word from an elder. So you hear how it's said, hello, and other things. So I think tribes are finally starting to figure out if we're going to keep our kids engaged, we're going to have to use technology in a way we've never used it before. And to tribal elders, that's a weird thing. So good question though. Thank you. He's on a roll.
So the stories that your grandmother told you, what's the most effective way that you've found to record those for future generations? Have you recorded them, and what have you done with them?
Yeah, I think our tribe's been really good with that. And Scott Christensen, who's here, I mean, I think we received a grant through the LDS Church to videotape a lot of our elders, and we've really encouraged that. And we started in 2000, I think, gathering this information from tribal elders and those who have. We just ask them a question and get them talking, and they'll talk for days if you let them. But my goodness, the amount of knowledge that's there is just fascinating to me. And I hear stories sometimes from elders that I'd never heard before, and I thought I've heard everything. But what my grandmother did as far as starting to write, she wrote down everything, really changed things for us. Because there's many times I think of some of the chiefs, Pocatello and Bear Hunter. You know, my tribe and our story comes from Chief Sagwitch, because my grandmother is a direct descendant, and that was her great grandfather. And so we tend to look at the Shoshone culture from the lens of him, because of my grandmother preserving all of those family stories and history. What's lost, though, I want to know the stories of Bear Hunter. I want to know the stories of Sandpitch or Pocatello. What were their lives really like deep down? And Scott wrote a wonderful book on Sagwitch when he was doing his graduate work here at USU. That is the most fascinating read ever. And but we've preserved that side of the tribe's culture. But man, I wish anybody that hasn't started writing down this stuff, we live in a time and age where it's just not getting passed down the way it used to. And if you don't start writing it down, it's lost forever. And I think many tribes have lost much of their cultural heritage and who they are today. And I think that's why there's such a big push for this traditional tribal knowledge to resurface and re-engage. But how much has been lost already in the meantime? So I spoke at an archaeology conference a few weeks ago, and I said, if I could go back to school again, I want to be an archaeologist. Yours is my second pick. Sorry. I always wanted to go live in a tent out in the desert for months. But what you do is really cool too. So
I'm just curious if you have an opinion. If you have someone doing an oral history interview and they're not part of that culture, do you think that it's better because you have people doing oral history interviews of their own elders, obviously you're going to get a different interview. So I suppose you would recommend that have someone from that same culture because you get that perspective. Then
Great question.
A white person interviewing Native Americans, still
Yeah.
you might have
Yeah.
disparaging.
Let me say this. Sometimes you have to go slow to go fast. And what I mean by that is as a white person, I don't know how else to say it. It takes time to develop a relationship with those elders. So go slow. And so if you want to really interview a tribal elder and get the good stuff and get honest from the heart stuff, you're right. You'd probably be better off having a member of the tribe do it, or take time so it's not a one-off. I'm here to interview you, tell me about this. That's going to be completely different than if you developed a friendship or a relationship with that person over a few months and made more than one phone call. Because we're so skeptical of people that want to appropriate and use us for one story. And we're so much more than one story. And so when I say sometimes you have to go slow to go fast, it's just taking the time to develop a personal relationship with that person, so they know you're not there to take advantage of the one time, and you know that you have their best interest at heart. And sometimes they may tell you a story, and that story was meant for that time and place. And it's not meant for you to use it 2 years later in another project you might have. That stuff's important, and especially to tribal people. And so I just think you're better off having a youth do it if you want, if it's a one-time thing, but it's complicated. You know, you're right. You're not going to get the same thing. Except if you interviewed me, I would do it because I see the value in what you do, though. But some of our elders don't. There's still a lot of deep trauma of being used and taken advantage of. To me, I had an elder call me an apple one time, and that was very disrespectful. And I knew dang well she was being disrespectful to me because she said, "You're red on the outside and white on the inside." Because I embrace what you're trying to do. I don't look at an archaeologist the way they do. I think you're trying to help us tell our story. Why wouldn't I embrace everything you want to do? Why wouldn't I collaborate with you? It's important for me to collaborate with you so you can preserve our stuff and you can help tell our story. And I think some of the younger generations understand that, but some of the older generations, and there's not many left, but those who are left have a deep, rich knowledge of things that we need to know. But it's going to take you a little bit of time to get there with them. So good question, though. That was great. My BYU friends. I actually guest lectured like 5 times there this spring semester.
So my question is about context and the importance of context, because a lot of these stories are told in particular contexts and they're meant to be in that context. So how do you capture the context in a meaningful way? And the second question I have is, a lot of this is oral tradition. And one of the best ways that we have to record oral tradition is to write it down. And how does that change what is being conveyed?
Oh my gosh. I'm not even going to answer the first one. I don't know. I mean, you stumped the chump. It's just, yeah, it changes. I don't know. I don't have any thoughts on that right now. I'm sorry. But we can talk. I'm sticking around all day today, so you're going to be sick of me. So grab me if you have another question, but we can talk about that. All I know is it's complicated a lot of times, and it's not the same. It's never the same. You can talk to me and you can talk to somebody else, and your experience is going to be completely different than unless you talk to me and then Eileen Quintana from the Nebo School District. She understands the importance of what you all do. And there's others that are like that, but man, it's tough sometimes. So any other questions? Oh, yes. No hard questions.
Okay, this one's gonna be maybe easy. So for like getting these stories, and not just, your people, but any culture, do you think it is, do you like the idea of video or just recording? Like video where you can see the person? Or which one do you think is?
I would
is better?
prefer that, because then you get
You get to see
expressions
somebody.
and yeah, and plus you're recording them as a person and how they tell stories, and there's so much more to storytelling than just what comes out of the mouth. And so I think you would capture all of that. If nobody has any more questions, I've got such a pet peeve with how we've dissed on oral history for so long. It's like somebody said, oh, well, I went to a conference and I was a speaker at a history conference, and it was right when my book came out. I brought some books. If you want a book, it's $10. If you don't, you can, if you don't want to pay for it, just take one. But I wrote this book and I'm here, and there's a TCU professor. And she said, so you wrote your book? And I said, yep. And she said, did you use primary sources? And I just wanted to I was really kind, but I thought, and I started thinking about primary sources a lot. And look, that's the world you're in. I get it. And history professors, I haven't gone back to get my master's because primary sources. But I think all the primary sources is somebody wrote it down a long time ago. It was still influenced by their biases, who they were as a person, but we put so much weight into this thing over here because somebody took the time to write it down and we preserved it like it's the gold standard. And it's not the gold standard. As long as you keep in mind that they had biases and things and perspectives of how they looked at the world by how they were raised. Was that actually factually correct? I don't know. But we give so much weight to it, and we give little weight to, well, that's just an oral history. And we all know if we tell a story and tell the next guy and the next guy, how much that changes. Well, in your world, it changes, but in my world, it doesn't. So when I said every word was important, that's why I don't show slides. I wanted you to hear every word. I didn't want you to look at the slide one time and maybe miss out on a word or two. That's how important that passing down of oral traditions is. And when you tell it and retell it and retell it, I have heard the story of the massacre from my grandmother 1,000 times. And every word was the same every time. And I can do it the same every time because of it. So it's just, to me, it's on par with any primary source you'll ever find. And it's rich and it's just as important. And I hope I conveyed that to you today. So I think sometimes we don't give it the respect that it deserves. But anytime we can record people and capture that, even kids, record kids, my gosh, that fourth grader, I wish I would have had a camera to record her.
So would it be okay in an oral history to do like a group of people sitting around? Is that something fun or good? Or
I think so. I'm open to any suggestions.
because then people get wild and start talking crazy talk.
That's the beauty of it,
Yeah.
though, right?
Yeah. Okay.
I had a big gathering at my house last weekend. We built a big fire and there was like 20 of us, 4 professors from Utah State. And we sat around and told stories all night. And it was the most magical thing ever. Even the white people's stories were pretty cool. I'm teasing. I'm going to get in trouble. So.
You have time for one more question? Anything on chat, Ryan?
No, it's just Michael Gates. I see his comment now. He just says also video can provide context. That's what he says. So video, talking about that, your question on video. Actually, I have a question, if that's okay, just really quick. I've been thinking a lot about, I know I'm guessing being SEMA, a lot of all of us coming from the Intermountain West, we probably likely have different records related to different Native American tribes in our collections. And I've just been thinking a lot about how we can, I don't know, provide the right amount of respect and for these records and for also the users of those records. And so I've just been kind of curious if you had any advice. It sounds like you've had some good relationships with other archives, Utah State, obviously, and BYU and some others. But maybe just from your own perspective, what any advice you'd have for us as archivists on how we can, I don't know, treat these records with more respect and how we provide access to them. If there's anything that you, from your perspective, could, any thoughts on that?
I just think if you live in a community, and you all do, if you're here get to know your Native American neighbors and who they are and the tribal culture that was there. Because I think the more you learn about somebody, the more empathy you have, the better able you're going to interject that with your work. If you have a better understanding of the people that were there, it's not just an archive now, then it becomes something that you actually probably care about because you've taken the time to learn about this indigenous culture that was there long before the pioneers came for thousands of years. And I just feel like I ran into some Afghan governors down in the Attorney General's office, and all I thought when I saw them is what I've seen on the news. And it was kind of scary for me. And then he saw me in the back and he asked them if they wanted to meet a Native American chief. So I walked up and I'm staring at him a foot away. And you know what? The fear kind of went away. And what I learned that day is if you get close, it's hard to hate when you get up close. And I learned the lesson that day is just take time to develop relationships in your communities. And then those archives mean something completely different than they did before. So thank you for that. Thanks, Clint, for having me.
Yeah, let's give Darren a little bit. All right, so like Darren said, he's got some books in the back corner. So check those out. And I believe we have a 15-minute break before our next session start. Or we'll have refreshments out in the main lobby. Be sure to check out our vendors and organizations and get your entries in for the drawing at the reception tonight. So